Hey gang, it is Monday, October 16th, 2017, and I'm working on the 2008 Honda Odyssey. You've probably seen this before. I've done other videos on this with the alternator and power steering components, but today I'm doing brake pads and rotors on the front. This is my wife's van, and the rotors have been giving us some trouble for a little while now, shaking violently when you hit the brakes. So found a little time, and I'm going to take care of that. Today I'm going to be using parts from Rock Auto. There's the part number for the rotors that I'm using. You can see right there. And then I'm also using raybestos hybrid brake pads. So it has ceramic and semi-metallic properties. And there's part numbers there. I'm also replacing the rear pads, which I'll do later. Front pads look really nice. Of course, they have the scraper built in, which is a big plus. Sometimes you have to transfer those. Also has a hardware kit, which I may or may not use. Typically, the factory kit or the factory hardware is better than the replacement stuff, so I tend to go with that. But as you can see, I already have it jacked up based on the jacking point on the rocker panel that you would use the factory jack. And of course a jack stand underneath. I've removed the tire and wheel, and the lug nuts were 22 millimeter. So let me get set up and show you how I'm going to do the rest of this. Okay, so the first step is going to be removing the caliper, and the bolts that hold it are 14 millimeter. There's one at the top and one at the bottom, and then where that bolt goes in, there's a sleeve there that mounts, and that is 19 millimeter. So what I'm going to do is use a long ratchet and a 14 millimeter socket, and I'm going to pull on it towards the back of the vehicle and leave the wrench catch the top of the assembly for the spindle. That way I'm not beating up my hands, and that comes loose. Then I'll repeat the step on the bottom, remove those two bolts. Alright, so at this point, remove the two bolts. You can see it looks like, in this case, it looks like it had a little bit of Loctite on the bolt, but that seems kind of odd. Normally these don't have Loctite. And that one actually looks cleaner. I don't see much on that. Slip the caliper off, and you're going to set it on top up here in the assembly so that it's not hanging by the hose. You don't want to ever let it hang by the hose. Then I'm going to wiggle out these brake pads, and there's still a little bit of life left on them. You can kind of see there, hopefully, maybe, but they need to be changed. Yeah, and that one has a scraper on it. Scraper face down. And I always take these pads, and the one I pull from the rear I'll set inboard of the wheel, and the one from the outside I'll set outboard. So to remove the bracket, there's two 19 millimeter bolts on the back side. So I'm going to get on the bottom one first, and I'm going to use my mallet and strike it to break it loose. Then I'll get the other one loose, and I'll show you the removal of the bracket. The upper one was a little bit harder to get, so I used a 1/2 inch ratchet with a 19 millimeter socket on it. Broke that loose, and these definitely have a little bit of Loctite on them. Remove those two bolts. They're exactly the same length, everything, and that the bracket comes off, and you can see the bolts actually thread into the bracket. So with that off, the next step is I'm going to remove this rotor. Now there's two screws right here that you can hopefully see. Those are Phillips head, and if you're lucky and you don't have a lot of corrosion like here in the south, you should be able to get these loose. So there's one. That's one nice thing about living in Georgia. There's two. And now that rotor comes right off. Now of course the next step will be installing the new rotor and reversing the process. So let me show you that. Now these new rotors, they come wrapped in plastic and they usually have a coat of oil on them, which this one does. And so what I'll do prior to installing this is clean it up with some brake parts cleaner and a paper towel. Sometimes I don't show this step on other videos I've done, and people get excited about that. So just making sure I cover all the bases. And again, I'll wipe it down once I get it installed anyway, but just want to make sure it's cleaned up. And now we've got these two holes once again across from each other. I'm going to line those up with the holes on the rotor. You can see the first one is below the bolt hole for the stud. So there's that. Then basically reverse what you've already done, or what you've removed. Alright, so I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on these bolt threads. And then I'm going to set the bracket back up in place. Now I can't tell you what the torque is on those. I'm sure you can find it if you looked online. But I'm kind of old school and I just make it tight. So I'm going to use my ratchet. Alright, now again I'm going to take a look at this hardware, and it looks to be in good shape. These the sleeves, or the receiving end where the bolt goes, and the bracket, you can pull those out and re-grease them if you like. I don't always do that, and I'm not going to do it on these. These are moving very freely, and so I have no problem with leaving them the way they are. Always make sure anytime you're doing this stuff you keep your hands clean so that you don't get any contaminants in the brake pads or on the rotor. So here's a new outer pad. I'm going to set that in place. And the new inner pad as well. Make sure it's nice and clean. So there we have the pads in place. The next step is going to be compressing the dual pistons in the caliper. And to do that, I take the old brake pad, and this tool, which I've shown in many other videos, is a simple compression tool. This one happens to have AC Delco written on it, but I'm sure other people make these things. And I'm going to put it in front of the caliper there and tighten this up, and what it'll do is it pushes in on the piston while this part holds it against the inside of the caliper. So I'll take let me show you another angle from that. So like I was saying, set the tool in and slowly compress those pistons in. Because there's two pistons, it's going to be pushing a little bit off center. if you can see what I mean there, because of that positioning. You can't push square on both of them at the same time. So I'm going to go slow and let it kind of catch up on it. You can see that one going in. Now as I'm doing this, I also want to monitor my brake fluid. And I've talked about this before. You know, normally a brake system is a closed system. And when you're compressing these pistons, it pushes fluid back up into the reservoir for the master cylinder. And if you have too much in there, if it's been over serviced, it'll try to push all that out. And what I normally do is I have a little plastic syringe that I use, something you can get from the pharmacy, and I extract out some fluid if need be and then put it in a separate container so it's out of the way. But again, I'll monitor that as I compress it. It's kind of hard to see with this vehicle. And get both of those back in. And there they are, fully compressed. If you want, you can slide over to the second piston and just push on it a little bit. Make sure it's in as well. Now that those are done, the next step is to reinstall the caliper. Alright, so without twisting the hose, rotate the caliper, slip it back into place, and you push in the little sliders at the top and the bottom to let the caliper set in. Now, since this showed evidence of some Loctite, I put a little bit on that bolt. I don't feel that it's necessary, honestly, but I'm just going to do it just to give it a little more security. And I put a little bit on the bottom bolt. And again, I can't tell you what the torque is. I do it by feel most of the time. And that little bolt, that retainer is going to want to turn, so I'll put the big wrench on. Making sure they're good and tight, but obviously not snapping them off. Okay, now there's a little bit of play in that caliper. You can see it moving around. The next thing I'll do is I'll depress the brake pedal a little bit and refill those pistons with brake fluid, because I'm going to do the other side and I want to have as much fluid out of the reservoir as I can, so that when I compress those pistons, it's not trying to push it back out. So let me take care of that. Just a couple of pumps, and that caliper should be snug, and it is. Alright, so all I have left to do now is reinstall this tire and wheel, get it off the jack stand, of course, and lower it down, and then I'll work on the other side. So that should take care of doing the front brake pads on this 2008 Honda Odyssey, and hope that was helpful. And as always, thanks for watching.